Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our session today on the basics of fostering an ethical corporate culture, held as part of our anti-corruption best practices program. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Pearl Initiative, we are the leading and only independent non-profit organisation founded to promote the business case for the implementation of the highest standards in corporate governance, transparency and accountability across the Gulf region's private sector. Launched in 2010 in cooperation with the United Nations Office for Partnerships, the Pearl Initiative aims to convene businesses, decision makers and future young leaders to take the lead in promoting and adopting greater governance standards. The Pearl Initiative also engages with the wider business ecosystem in the Gulf region, collaborating with over 30 regional universities and partnering with over 40 companies to collectively drive our mission forward. We work as a think tank and build data by publishing cutting-edge research reports and case studies to inspire business change. As we know, we're all currently chartering in unknown territories these days with the new updates about the tumultuous implications of the global pandemic on our social and economic lives. We at the Pearl Initiative have designed our webinar series to provide insights on key trends and behaviours that can support businesses as they enter into the post-COVID era, or the new normal as it's often framed. Today's session is focused on deconstructing corporate culture in the face of pre- and post-COVID-19 challenges. As cultures pass down from long-serving employees to newer employees, the process of embedding codes, policies and procedures across the organisation becomes complex. We also do know that organisational culture isn't just a case of written regulations, rules and policies, but it's also influenced by unwritten codes and natural governance of how we really do things around here in an organisation. As more and more employees work from home too, the challenge of embedding these codes becomes even more complicated. So leveraging the expertise and knowledge from our guest speakers here with us today, this webinar will outline the difficulties associated with embedding ethical corporate cultures in organisations, as well as the various means through which organisations can overcome these challenges and difficulties. Joining us today is Chief Compliance Officer of PepsiCo Africa, Middle East and South Asia, Nigel Benstead. Nigel was responsible for designing, implementing and administering PepsiCo's compliance programs across the region, ensuring that senior management exhibits the appropriate tone from the top by supporting and sponsoring a robust compliance program and demonstrating a strong ethical tone through PepsiCo's Performance with Purpose agenda. Nigel joined PepsiCo London's office in 1993 and has over 25 years of experience implementing anti-bribery and anti-corruption sanctions and culture of integrity programs, as well as running PepsiCo's values, code of conduct and speak up training. Prior to joining PepsiCo, Nigel worked for the UK law firm Freshfields in London, Hong Kong and New York. Thank you, Nigel, for joining us today. We also have Michael.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. We also have Michael Pollitt, Senior Business Ethics Consultant at GoodCorporation, joining us from London. A regular speaker and trainer on business ethics and issues of ethical company culture, Michael has conducted business ethics training sessions and webinars across the MENA region, including most recently a one-day long workshop on business ethics and compliance with clients and potential clients of the European Bank in Cairo. His experience in the MENA region also includes work in Algeria and Saudi Arabia. Before joining GoodCorporation, Michael worked as the lead researcher and advisor on business ethics to the chair of the Modern Slavery Bill Evidence Review at the UK Parliament. While in Parliament, Michael worked with a number of high-profile UK politicians, government ministers and government suppliers, focusing on business ethics in general and human rights in particular. A regular speaker and commentator on business ethics and ethical business culture, Michael conducts an annual guest lecture on business ethics to undergraduate and MBA candidates at the University of Kent. He also contributes regularly to mainstream and CSR publications on issues of responsible business policy, with articles appearing in New Statesman, Foreign Policy, African Business, Financial Management, Ethical Corporation, Ethical Performance, HR Magazine, and Human Resource Management International Digest. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Thanks very much.
We do like to make our webinars as interactive as possible, despite not having the human engagement element, but we do encourage you to ask questions through our interactive panel. The Q&A function on the panel, those will go straight through to both Michael and Nigel, and they'll try and answer those throughout the session. I'll now hand over to our speakers for today. I believe the format will be that Michael will go through a 10-minute presentation highlighting the work of GoodCorporation, and then he will initiate a deep dive with Nigel, in conversation with Nigel. Thanks again and enjoy.
Thanks very much, Yasmin. That was a fantastic introduction. So As Yasmin said, my name's Michael. I work with a company called GoodCorporation, and I'm not going to talk to you too much about what we do. You know, this is not about marketing or sales. This is about explaining how our work might be relevant to you and relevant to this discussion. And that should be an interactive discussion, as Yasmin says. I'm only going to talk for about 10 minutes, and because I'd really like to get to the conversation part. So in terms of who we are then and what we do, so we are a specialist assessment and advisory company in the area of business ethics and compliance. We've been doing that for about 20 years. I haven't been with GoodCorporation for 20 years, but the company's been doing that for a very long time, and it's formed by people who came out of KPMG and wanted to do ethics work or work that was more meaningful in the area of consultancy and assessment. And since then, we have grown, and we've done something like over 600 assessments now. And I'll talk to you a bit more about what an assessment means when we talk about business ethics assessments in over 80 countries. And I'll show you some of the countries where we've worked in a minute. But crucially for this conversation, we are not just about business ethics in general, or we're not about compliance in general. We also have specific areas of work on ethical company culture. It's a hard area to define. It's a hard thing to get right, but it's something to which we've been dedicating a lot of resource, especially in the last few years. So this is where we work. So as I said before, we've worked in well over 80 countries now. And as you can see, a lot of that work has been in the area of the world relevant to this discussion. One of the first jobs I did with GoodCorporation was out in Saudi Arabia. And that was a business ethics assessment for a large European oil and gas company. And it's a good kind of case study for what we do, because this particular oil and gas company has a beautiful bound glossy code of conduct, which sits on coffee tables at their head offices in Paris. And they need to make sure that doing business out in areas of the world which are a lot more complicated can be done in a way that is consistent with their code of conduct. And that's what we do. We spent 2 weeks in the affiliate of this particular oil and gas company, getting to know the way people worked, getting to know the culture of the organization, and then helping the parent company to put in place systems to help it improve. And these are some of our clients. So 20 years worth of work has gathered us a lot of clients. As you can see, lots of European big oil and gas, but also slightly more UK-centric areas like the Premier League and the BBC, for whom we've done work in the areas of child safeguarding, for example, because we try to cover the whole spectrum of business ethics issues. At first, it was business ethics in general, then it became issues to do with the Bribery Act when the Bribery Act came out. But increasingly, our spectrum of work has grown quite a lot, and that's taken us into the area of ethical culture, which I'd like to talk a bit more about today. So in terms of culture as a business issue then, it's not always been something that people have talked about, certainly not in a very concrete sense, because it hasn't been for that long that people have been looking to really measure culture and get a handle on culture the way we have done with other issues like business ethics or anti-bribery and corruption, for example. So I tried to set out here some of the key kind of markers over the past few years that show us how culture has developed as a business concept. So there was a study done about 4 years ago now by EY of the FTSE 350, which found that only 19% of board directors felt any kind of responsibility for the culture of their organization. So there was a sense back then that it wasn't something for the boardroom, it must sit somewhere else. And anyway, we did our own survey in 2017, and we looked at a lot of lower level employees and people in middle management, etc. And only about 59% of those people from our research found that their company, or felt that their company, had a strong ethical culture. So it felt towards the back end of 2017 as if culture was kind of homeless as an issue. It didn't really have a place where it could easily sit within an organization. The board weren't doing very much on it. Employees felt that, you know, they didn't feel as if it was being taken very seriously. And so maybe for that reason, the requirements in the UK changed around 2018, making it mandatory for boards to monitor and assess their culture. So suddenly it became a much more of a concrete business issue, and people in boards of the listed companies in London have to now measure their culture, they have to report on their culture, and crucially they have to be able to show any areas where management has taken action to improve that culture. And that was a huge step forward in terms of people taking culture seriously as a business issue. But then in 2019, the Department of Justice in the US revised their guidance for effective evaluation of compliance programs. And there was a renewed focus on culture as something that you would need to support effective compliance programs to keep you out of trouble when it came to bribery and corruption. I'm aware that this webinar is being done in the context of the anti-corruption series, and it's important to demonstrate that culture is now seen as a key part of getting anti-bribery and corruption right. And so it's gone from a concept without a home to being a concept which you have to report on, to being a concept which the Department of Justice in the US, in terms of the FCPA and the American anti-bribery legislation, is taking very seriously as a key ingredient of a good compliance program. So this is a very timely webinar. This is a very timely session to be talking about this stuff. And you don't need me to tell you that what it looks like when culture goes wrong is a very public issue. So sometimes we deal with companies who have been dealing with internal cultural issues for a long time, but they only really take notice of it when it hits the press. And these things hit the press pretty hard. And it can become a very public issue when it's something that you've been dealing with internally for a long time. And I'd like to take out one particular kind of case study from that, because everybody knows the headlines. But going back to 2016, the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal, people viewed that as a crisis of ethics. They viewed it as cheating. A lot of people felt very let down by Volkswagen, and it's been dealing with it ever since. But there was a study done around the time of the Dieselgate scandal by Fortune magazine that looked at the cultural drivers underpinning that kind of behavior within the organization, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So around the time the article writes, Volkswagen was driven by a ruthless, overweening culture. I'm quoting here from the article: it was run like an empire with overwhelming control in the hands of a few people, a high-octane mix of ambition, arrogance, micromanagement, epic family power plays, blood feuds. It's like something out of Game of Thrones, but it's a description of the culture within the company at the time. And it was a culture that mandated success at all costs. Well, I think you don't need me to tell you what the costs were of that culture in the long term, because the Volkswagen share price halved when the emission cheating came to light and remained at roughly half its pre-crisis peak about 2 years later. And it's something which has been in the press recently as well, and it's something the company is still recovering from. So I was asked to do a little bit on the view from the UK, and I'm sitting here in London, where unusually the sun is shining at the moment, but I was asked to give a bit of a background to how people feel about culture in the UK. And this is some of our research that came out before lockdown, where we asked people how they felt about the ethical culture of their organization. And only 50% of the people that we spoke to trusted their manager to do the right thing, which is a key element of a good corporate culture in terms of the examples that are being set by managers. Over 25% of people thought their manager would bend the rules if they needed to get the job done. Again, there's that disconnect, that lack of cultural integration between employees and management level. Only 59% felt that they were able to raise concerns. We were doing this as part of our research, but sometimes it was the first time these people had spoken up about the poor ethical culture in their organization. And only 59% thought their organization had a good culture, which I talked about before. So overall, in the UK, we could say that before lockdown, the picture was pretty bad. And so we started thinking about what a good culture should look like, which is the other thing I was asked to touch on briefly. And we came up with these 10 key ingredients of a good ethical culture. And none of the things on the screen now should be surprising. This is all stuff that's pretty obvious stuff. But what we've tried to do is take the obvious and make it into something you can measure, make it into something practical, make it into a tool that you can use to improve. So going through these very quickly then, it's the tone from the top. So that example being set by management, treating employees fairly, taking personal development seriously. So making sure people in the organization know and can sense that they are not static. If they want to progress as a person and in their career, then they can. Trust in management to do the right thing, we've already talked about, is often lacking. Supporting employees to do the right thing. So if you make a decision as an employee, which might be more of an ethical decision than a business decision, you would have the support to do that. Confidence in raising concerns, so being able to feel like you can tell people when something goes wrong. Health and safety is an obvious one. Customers treated fairly. Treating suppliers fairly, we think we'll talk a bit more about in this session, because that's a really interesting area. And finally, making sure you respect the environment and the local community. Now, that's the kind of playbook, that's the perfect. We are not living in a perfect world, and we have been not living in perfect times for quite a long time now. So it becomes very hard to keep those 10 pillars as strong as you would like them to be when you are faced with a global pandemic beyond anything we've seen in living memory. And so just to get the ball rolling with Nigel and in this conversation, I had to think about some key challenges that we have for maintaining that good corporate culture in the age of remote working, which doesn't just mean people sat in lovely home offices like this. It means people whose movement has been restricted like never before, people who don't have access to the same working environments that they had before. And we came up with these 8 things that we're going to use to get the ball rolling. So number one, if you're talking about tone from the top, in the age of lockdown and in the age of coronavirus, you've got to make sure that that top level decision making to do with the virus is transparent, that people can see why the management is behaving in a certain way or taking certain courses of action, and that crucially financial burdens are shared in a safe way or in a fair way between management and employees, and that a good tone is being set from the top. In terms of treating employees fairly, nowadays in the time of lockdown, that means accounting for different things like people working from home with childcare commitments or homeschooling commitments, and making sure you've given them that flexibility to be able to be a good employee and also be a good father or mother or a carer, whatever it is. In terms of the personal development piece, there's plenty that we can do in terms of at-home training options for people, such as e-learning or webinars like we're doing today. There's tons of scope to make sure that pillar of a good culture is maintained. On the speak up piece, making sure that employees are aware of the mechanisms that they have to speak up. Obviously, there's the formal speak up grievance mechanisms, but also just feeling like they can talk to their manager if they need to, or talk to a designated colleague if they need to, so that they don't feel alone or isolated at a time when lots of people are. And then it becomes a bit more interesting if you look at how you consider your stakeholders. At GoodCorporation, we don't just think about the stakeholders being employees, we also think more broadly about suppliers and partners. And so if we were to map the stakeholders, the suppliers, partners, etc., that have been most exposed to the impact of lockdown, we would probably find suppliers or partners who have been more affected by the shortage of migrant labor, or who have massive restrictions on their access to health services or social protections. And we would be encouraging our clients to identify any business practices that they have, which are putting unnecessary additional pressure on those partners. So if we are dealing with suppliers, do we have deadlines that are too short? Are we cancelling orders in a short-sighted way? Are we delaying payment? And then once you've done that, once you've identified how you might be contributing and where your partners might be most exposed, providing some kind of crisis support so that you are still treating your suppliers fairly, because you're giving them all the resources that they need to be able to maintain business continuity, which ultimately will make your relationship with them more sustainable in the long term. And finally, and I'm going to close on this, if we were looking at environment and community as a key ingredient of ethical culture, the community has never needed us more than it does now. So this would be about reallocating your resources to provide protective services. I've got clients who have been making PPE using machines and factories that used to make parts for oil and gas companies, and partnering with local NGOs so that we all feel like we're doing this together and that our businesses are not separate from the overall crisis, but part of the solution. And Nigel, I hope that gives us enough to get the ball rolling. That's my 10 minutes, or maybe even more than. But that's who we are, the way we approach this, and some key ideas we thought for a starter.
I think you've set up enough there to keep us going for the next 12 hours or so, possibly 24. So, do you have a specific question, or
well, I
just talk?
Your perspective on this, and in terms of the background to which you come at it, and the approach that you've taken, because I think there's no right way of doing this, and it'd be interesting to know how you've done it.
Well, as I say, there's a lot that you've said, and there's a lot that I can talk about. Look, I agree with pretty much everything that you've said. I was sitting here nodding away. As was said in the introduction, I've been working for PepsiCo for 25 years. I've actually been head of their compliance and ethics department in this part of the world for just over 11 years. And what you've seen an evolution of a compliance department that started off pretty heavily focused on compliance, and definitely it's evolved into a compliance and ethics department. And indeed, we've got on the agenda at the moment a discussion about whether we actually ought to change to ethics and compliance, which may seem like a small thing, but to me it is actually the right time to talk about ethics leading to compliance rather than the other way around. I actually personally believe that if you get the ethics right, the compliance will follow. If you're focused solely on compliance, you may be able to comply without being ethical. So I've always talked about ethics being the stronger influencer. And I think particularly, at a time of crisis, it is so important to get the ethics right for all of the reasons you've laid out, which it's not just about your employees, it's also about your business partners, and it's also about the community. And there are so many more responsibilities than just your business making money, because where people tend to go wrong, and I'm just speaking off the top of my head, is when they look at short-term profit, and therefore they will cut corners, they will take decisions for the short term, which in the long term don't actually help them, which is again why I think ethics is more important. We've been recognized as one of the world's most ethical companies by a particular organization called Ethisphere ever since it came into existence. So I think we've got 14 years now of winning this award. And one of the things that has always interested me about Ethisphere is they also do a survey of companies who win their award, competing against companies who don't. That's not to say they're not ethical, they're just not winning their award. And by the way, you have to apply to win it. So if you're not applying, you may not win it in the first place. However, they have demonstrated consistently that ethical companies actually outperform non-ethical companies, which does reinforce my statement about, it's actually good business practice to be ethical. It's not just a feel-good factor that makes you warm and fuzzy inside. It is actually the better way to make money. And that's a very strong message to deliver to the business, that this is not about, because we are a philanthropic organization, we like to do good for the community, we like to join in CSR programs. It's not just an aside making us feel good about the fact we're making money. It's actually a better way to do business. And coming back to COVID-19, the situation we're in at the moment, two things, right? You mentioned earlier that look, we're all human. and nobody's perfect. No organization is perfect. We all make mistakes. We are designed to make mistakes. And I've been very interested recently at looking at behavioral science, not just independently, but because I've attended conferences that are talking about behavioral science and moving the compliance and ethics agenda forward and thinking about how you can affect people's behavior. And the reality is that most humans will make mistakes unless they're put in the right environment that causes them not to, or causes them not to want to make mistakes. And I think at the time of COVID-19, there will be a lot of pressure on people for all sorts of reasons. And it's even more important that we're giving this ethical guidance to make sure that people do business the right way, because they will be tempted not to, and they will justify, they will come up with reasons why it's okay not to do it on this occasion. And quite often they'll blame it on COVID-19. I would normally look to do things the right way, but I can't because of COVID-19. I would look to support the community, but I can't because of COVID-19. Or flip it around the other way, because I'm looking to support the community, I'm not going to follow the usual guidelines. So we are in a time where ethics is even more important, and it's even more important that we look to do business the right way. So that was a convoluted view of my thoughts in general to what you said, but go ahead, Michael. I'm sure you've got a question.
Really interesting stuff. I think I can pick up on that. So I'm struck that you used several terms there. You talked about business ethics, talked about compliance, talked about CSR, talked about philanthropy. I guess a good initial question would be, how do you define what we're talking about? How do you define business ethics? That's number one. And number two, to what extent do you think an individual's own ethics or an individual's own ethical culture would be affecting the ethics of the whole or the organizational culture of the place where they're working?
So I think when you start with the question about business ethics, to me, and I touched on this earlier, it's about wanting to do business the right way, right? Compliance is you have to do it. It's the law, it's the policy. I must do it. And if you focus too much on the letter of the law, if you are hiring smart people, which we tend to do in good companies, then smart people will find a way around it, because they will look purely at the rule and the guidelines and they'll think, well, how do I get around it? Ethics is the spirit, and I think it was quoted on the publicity that went out for this webinar today. Ethics is really the spirit. It's looking not just to comply with the letter of the law, but trying to understand what we're trying to get to. Why is it important that we do things that way? And if you buy into the ethics, and it all comes to awareness and training and education, if you buy into the ethics, you don't want to get around the law. You actually want to follow the law or the policy or the guidelines, because you understand that it's the right thing to do. It's the better way to do business. So that my definition of business ethics is a way of doing business that not only benefits the company, but does benefit the customers, benefits the environment, benefits the community, and benefits the individual. Because at the end of the day, if the company is doing well, then the employees share in the success of the company. So everyone benefits from good business ethics. In terms of your second question, which I've completely forgotten, so you'll have to remind me.
So if we're all coming into work every day with our own definition of business ethics, to
Right.
what extent does an individual's business ethics or ethical culture affect the overall organization? How does that happen?
Look, I actually think however much you have a business culture, and we're always trying to improve it all the time, and it will evolve all the time, I think individuals do have a significant influence, and so their interpretation of business ethics will have an effect on the culture. And I see it in I'm responsible for several geographical areas of the world, and I deal with lots of senior people, and they're all different. And some I smile and clap when I hear them talk, and I think, oh, they've really got it, or at least if they haven't, they're saying the right thing. And again, in this period of COVID-19, there are a lot of online webinars, not only for like we're doing today, but actually for our business. There's a lot of Zoom meetings and things going on, and your ethical manager will be vocal. He won't just be seen to be doing the right thing, he will actively talk about doing the right thing. And others will almost take it for granted. They'll think, well, of course I'm ethical. I know I'm ethical. I know I'm not doing the wrong thing. So why do I have to talk about it? And if I say to someone, please make sure in these times of crisis you hit your sales numbers, of course I mean do it the right way. But the strong ethical leader will not only assume that people will do it the right way, he or she will remind them to do it the right way. So I think that individuals play a big part, which is where I get involved. Is where my job is to remind people to keep ethics at the front of the conversation and to be vocal about doing business the right way. And we've seen that evolve again over the 11 years certainly that I've been in charge, that we do have ethical training, which is difficult because people think, well, why do I have to be trained to do good? Why do I have to be trained to do right? I don't need to be trained to do that. And yet it's the nuances. It is the sometimes just doing what's legal isn't enough. Right, and those are the examples that you can share with people about, and I give you one of them. Right, talk about CSR programs. If you're operating a plant in a jurisdiction where it's located by a busy road, and the local community the authorities come to you and say, look, we've noticed that a lot of people are crossing this road at the end of their shift, accidents have been caused, even deaths, and you as one of the members of the business community, we'd like you to contribute to a footbridge that goes over the road because that will avoid accidents and deaths. We don't actually have the money ourselves, so we'd like you to contribute, and we're asking other businesses to contribute as well. Now, if we had a poll here, who would say that's a good thing to do, right? It is. It's absolutely a good thing to do. The problem comes when at the same time as that request is coming in, we realize that we have lapsed on an operating license and technically we shouldn't be operating without that license. And so we're going to the authorities and saying, look, we've realized we've lapsed. I'm sorry. Would you allow us to continue to operate even though our license has lapsed? And when you have those two things that are put together in the same conversation, it can look like, even if you don't intend it to, that you're asking for a continuation of your license, albeit to be allowed to do business without that license. And in return, it can look like somebody is saying, will you give us some money to contribute to a certain project? And sometimes, even though you may know in your own mind that you're doing the right thing, you have to say, I can't do that because it doesn't look right. It may not be illegal, or at least I may have good legal arguments as to why it's okay. But you have to take a decision about, I'm not going to do it this way. I have to think of a different way to do it because I realize that it's not going to look good. And my second example very quickly would be, in the world of, unfortunately, sexual harassment. Some countries have very protective, no, it's the wrong word, that they have rather archaic laws on you can't dismiss someone for sexual harassment, for example, unless you have 3 or 4 male witnesses. Now, as an organization, you may find you've only got 1 witness, and you may decide the right thing to do is to get rid of that individual because you don't want that type of person in your organization. The law may not assist you. And you may decide that in order to do the right thing, which is to get rid of that individual, you're going to have to come to a compromise, which is probably going to cost you money. And you've got to be prepared to spend that money because it's the right thing to do. So 2 examples of where I think ethics can go beyond the law.
And there's a really good way, those examples are really good ways of picking up on that binary between one's individual ethics and the ethics of the company, because in your first example, the intention of the person paying for the road is totally good. It's according to their ethics, that's a good thing to do. But if you were being more intelligent about it, as you said, you would know how that could be perceived. So there's a difference between bringing your own ethics to work and saying, as long as I know I'm doing the right thing, then I can do whatever I want. But being more intelligent about it and being aware of how it might be perceived, that's the kind of other side of it. And that's a great kind of add-on to bringing your own ethics to work, which I think is exactly what people should be doing as a starter. But I'm also struck by the kind of inverse of this, because I asked you about the effect of individuals on overall culture. Well, one of the things we see quite a lot in our assessment work is the effect of overall culture on the individual. So we've met, and we in our work we do a lot of interviewing, and we've interviewed a lot of people who are wholly good people. These are people whose ethics can be trusted, their own ethics. But they are put in environments sometimes in companies where the ethical rules are not the same, and where they can see people getting away with certain things which they might not agree with, but once you've seen someone get away with it for a long time, or you've seen someone get rewarded for that kind of behavior, or you've seen that that's the kind of behavior to get you further up in the company, then suddenly your own internal ethics starts to shift, and it starts to fit the mold in which you're operating. And that can be a really interesting kind of other side of the coin, not just thinking about effective individuals and overall culture, but how we become ethically the products of our environment. Have you seen any of that in your own work?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I was referring earlier to behavioral science, because that is exactly it. It is talking about your environment can change you. And again, you may sit there thinking you're a very ethical person, but you're being influenced by your environment. And I attended a conference last year that talked about the shredder test. And I don't know whether you're familiar with that. I wasn't. But the shredder test is apparently a very well-known behavioral science test. And very quickly and simply, it is a tough mathematical test, 10 questions, right? And you give it to your what's it called, your sample, to get a data, can't think of the right word, to get a data average on how hard this test is. So you give it to people and they score 4 out of 10 an average. Okay, so you know that on average people are going to score 4 out of 10 on this test, right? Then you get your test sample, and it can be your employees, a bunch of bankers, a bunch of politicians or whatever. You put them in a room and you say, look, we want you to take this test, and we're going to give you $10 for every question you get right. And by the way, we trust you. So you're going to mark your own papers, and you're going to come up at the end. You're going to tell us how much you've scored, and we're going to pay out your reward. And by the way, when you come up at the end, because we trust you, on the way up to tell us how much you've scored, you're going to shred your answers in a shredder. Then what do you find the average score goes up to? And the answer is it goes up to 6. So people will automatically lie, but they will usually justify it. They will come up with, I would have got that. I made a stupid mistake. I actually knew the answer, so I'm going to give myself that one. Then you look at how you can be influenced by your environment. And what they found was when you put people in a room that, say, have religious iconography around the room, they tend to cheat less. When you put a code of ethics or a code of conduct on the room, around the room, people tend to cheat less. So you can actually influence people by the environment that you put them in, which when we bring it back to a culture of ethics and compliance, it is important that we have the reminders on the wall. It is important that we have the messaging. It is important that we have the tone and people leading by example, because all of those things, they may be very little, they may seem very little, but they actually have a very positive effect.
Well, that's a really interesting question I'd like to pick up then. So I began today by talking about the example of the French oil and gas company that has its beautiful bound and glossy code of conduct on the coffee tables in Paris, and how you make sure that those standards, which have been agreed by a committee and put out in some 60-page code of conduct, how do you make sure those standards are a living, breathing part of the organization? And you talked about communications, posters, etc. I would say that assessments are a big part of that. and training, because I've seen from my own work what a big difference this can make if you send somebody into the organization and they live with them for 2 weeks and then tell them how they can improve. Are there any other key things that we can be doing to make sure those codes of conduct that we spend a lot of time getting right, to make sure they become a real part of the business, in your opinion?
Lots of things is the answer, and I could give you a list of 10 things, and next year that will be out of date. So one of the things is, and that's why you have compliance and ethics departments, is you have to continue to evolve, you have to continue to learn. One of the biggest compliments somebody paid me was to say, yeah, Nigel, I've heard you talk about this particular subject about 10 times now, and you always say it slightly differently, but you're actually delivering exactly the same message. You've got to keep it real, you've got to keep it live, you've got to keep it interesting, right? You've got to come up with examples. It can't be just pure black and white training, because people don't have the time for that and they don't have the interest, and you will turn them off very quickly if you're just sprouting rules at them. You've really got to get them engaged and come back to what I said earlier about understanding what we're trying to achieve here, understanding that it is not just about complying with the rule or the law. It's understanding what we're trying to do as a corporation, because we really believe we have a business advantage in doing business the right way. And then you've got to be constantly monitoring. So you've got to promote it. You've got to train right in the first place. So a lot of people talk about different ways to train. Traditional training of 10 years ago doesn't work anymore. Again, people's attention span doesn't last that long. So if you really think you're going to do 2 hours of compliance and ethics training, dream on. You've got to make it shorter. You've got to be sound bites. It's got to be accessible. You've got to be able to pick it up and read it on your phone when you're on the move and do your training on the move. And so you've got to be monitoring whether it works. And you've actually got to realize that one size doesn't fit all. And you will find that in some cultures, and I'm talking about maybe country cultures, that what may work in Australia won't necessarily work in China, or vice versa. So you've got to be constantly testing, is what I'm doing working, or do I have to do it differently? And above and beyond everything else, you have to recognize that you can have the best code in the world, you can have the best training program in the world, but people tend to take direction from their immediate manager. So you have to cascade down this culture, down through senior to middle management and below, because people will follow the instructions of their manager. And if that tone is wrong, it really undermines everything else that you've got. And you've got to be able to have a transparent and open speak up culture that people trust in, that they can be telling you where things are going wrong, and you can go in and help make things right again. And speak up is all about, it's not about punishing people, it's not about who can we punish today, it's where are things wrong and how can we make it better. It's got to be seen that the compliance and ethics department is there to help, it's there to help the business, and it's a positive thing, not a negative thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've got a lot to pick up on there, but we've just had a question from the audience that we might like to pick up on here. So it says, great discussion. I'd like to ask if the COVID-19 pandemic has affected business ethics in a negative way. So this would be, I think, this ties in quite neatly with some of the things that I talked about in the initial presentation, is that, yes, of course, it can affect business ethics in a negative way. It could mean that certain things are going on within your supply chain which are a lot more difficult than they used to be. There could be people working for you indirectly who are in parts of the world where it's a lot more difficult to respond to the challenges of COVID-19, and there are things as a business that we can do about that. We are a lot better as businesses now at kind of mapping what's out there. We do a lot more work as GoodCorporation on things like human rights risk mapping. But we can do mapping of our supply chain on the COVID-19 aspect as well, to see where in our supply chain has been worst hit by the virus, where maybe people don't have the freedom of movement that they need to get their human rights respected, where do they not have access to the healthcare services or the social protections that they need to get through this. And I think, yeah, the potential, to answer the question, the potential negative impact of COVID-19 is huge on the ethics of our businesses. But I think there's also more opportunity than ever to get to know where the problems are, what we can do about them, and where our own practices might be even making them worse. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that one, Nigel.
Look, I think risks have definitely been exacerbated, but I do agree with you that the opportunities are there as well. So, we've got to make sure we get the balance right. I mean, first and foremost, you have individuals out there who are worried in the workplace about catching the disease, and they can be worried about passing it on to their family, and they can have elderly relatives, and that is a real concern. So you're having to deal with those issues of people, genuine issues of people being concerned about the virus, and should they be made to come to work, should they be told to stay at home, and all of that aspect of employees, right? So there are risks of people coming up with excuses for not coming to work, or simply not being able to work because of everything else that's going on at home, which you're going to have to deal with and cope with, because that is, you want the organization coming out stronger, not weaker as a result of this pandemic. Then you've got the communities. And give you an example of, we closed down a plant in one country, even though we had the approval to keep it open, because the community was concerned, and because it was a plant that was located far away from the cities. Most of the workers came from the local community, and we had to sit down with the leaders of the community and explain to them what we were doing to make the working environment safe. And we wanted them to buy into, yes, it's okay to open up the plant. So even though we had the legal right to keep it running, we chose to shut it down. So it is looking at the safety of the community as well as the individual employees. And then, as you say, customers, look, we are selling a lot of product. People are still buying our product at the moment. People want Pepsi and they want Lay's, and they're snacking as much as they were before. But there are a lot of our customers that haven't actually been in business. I mean, we sell to airlines that aren't flying. We sell to cinemas that aren't showing films. We sell to sports stadium that haven't been operating. So what you said earlier about taking into consideration, you can be black and white about, well, you can't pay for it, so you can't have it, or you're breaching your contract, so we're going to terminate you. And is that a long-term strategy that's going to pay off? You actually may want to support those customers, and so that they will still be there in the long term, that when things start to open up and they're back in business, they remember what you did for them and how you helped them. So there are a lot of different angles. And coming back to behavioral science, maybe somebody is in a family where somebody else has lost their job. That puts them, that puts them under even more pressure to perform. And so the risks of them taking shortcuts, because in the moment they believe that's the right thing to do, or the thing that will keep them their job, right? That is a real risk. Those risks occur. And even governments who are trying to find extra funding, government officials may come to you and ask for favors, give you promises. If you do this, then we'll do that. So I think the risks are all out there. But I do think that there is enough connectivity, and we're lucky to live in a world with connectivity, where if you keep the messaging going, if you keep the transparency, right, if you keep the education and the learning seminars, etc., you can actually balance all those risks, and you can come out at least in as good a place, if not better place, than you were before.
I totally agree with that, and I think it kind of brings to mind the fact that, yes, COVID-19 is a huge international pandemic, but it also makes the world a bit smaller, because we're all going through the same thing at the same time. So there's never been a better time to map your supply chains. There's never been a better time to reach out to your local communities, because yes, this is something whose scale is unprecedented, but it also means that we're all going through the same thing at the same time, and there's opportunities to get a better visibility of the people you affect and the people you deal with on a day-to-day basis. And the other big thing that's been in the news recently is the Black Lives Matter issues that have been coming up, especially in the States. And one of the questions we just had from the audience is, in the context of Black Lives Matter and the heightened awareness of respecting and including minorities, do we think this will have a lasting impact on company culture? It's very tempting for us to just talk about the impact of COVID in years to come, but what about the Black Lives Matter thing? And the other question is, do you think this will have a lasting shift on the way employees treat ethics and compliance, or do you think it will just be a kind of blip on the radar? I don't know if you have any immediate thoughts on that, Nigel.
Look, I think both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matters will both have a lasting effect. You know, on COVID-19, there will be different business practices for sure. I don't think we'll travel as much. I think we'll use Zoom and other forms of meetings rather than traveling. And I think COVID-19 has already focused us more on what we can do, focused us more on what we can do for our employees, different types of employees. Frontline workers may be different from office workers, and we've certainly changed our medical program for frontline workers because of that. So COVID-19 will change the world forever, for sure, and I think in a good way when we come out of this. Black Lives Matters, again, it's something that's kicked off that is focusing people on racism, right? And that can't be a bad thing. If you read in the news, our CEO has just promised a program of its, they're putting in $400 million into a program that is to, you know, protect and further the education and performance in our company of minorities. So I think, again, that will change the way we look at things, hopefully forever, and that will have a knock-on effect into other areas, because it's not just about racism. It's about, you know, sexual harassment. It's about you know, different types of harassment. It's about doing business the right way, in as we would want people to treat all human beings. So I think both the importance of health and safety, which has been brought to the front in COVID-19, and the Black Lives Matter movement, which is focusing on racism, will actually both lead to a better business environment. And even if it's only the money that's been promised towards these things, and money isn't everything, but it's a good start. That is somebody seriously saying we need to do things differently. And I do believe that both will continue. I don't believe it's a blip. I think it starts from here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the one of the things that comes to mind when we start talking about race and ethnicity in the context of ethical business culture is that, for me, it's a good example of where internal culture meets external culture. So you could have a business which is populated entirely by white, middle-class, middle-aged men, and who, you know, if you did a survey within that company, they would all say, yeah, the culture here is fantastic. I've never had any problems. Everyone's always really nice to me. But if you were to look at that externally, and if you were to hold a mirror up to that from an outsider's perspective, which is often what we try and do, you'd see that something's systemically gone a bit wrong there. You know, it's not okay. Even if they're all happy, even if they're all fine, something along the way has gone wrong. That means everybody's the same size and shape from an ethnicity point of view. So it's a hard thing to kind of get a handle on, and there's been a lot written and a lot done recently about how to, you know, make improvements in this area. I think there's a lot more work to do, and it should be, if we're doing things right, COVID-19 will become a kind of line in the sand where we say we can never go back to the old ways of doing things, and there's several things, maybe even unrelated to COVID, where we can build back better and start to do things that we never would have thought of doing before. So there's a few other questions that have come in. So another one is about, it's coming back to the training point that we touched on before, Nigel. It's about the impact of personal culture on corporate culture, and whether we can manage that through training. I'm sure you've got some fantastic training programs on your side, and obviously it's a big part of what we do. Do you think training is enough to embed, and we keep using this word embed, but I think it's important, to embed the kind of culture that we're talking about?
I don't think training itself is enough. It depends how you define training, because I think the annual training that you do once a year, or if you're lucky enough you're doing twice a year, is never enough. It can't be seen as something that you come out of your day job, you do a bit of training, you tick a box, and you go back to your day job, right? the whole point about the culture of ethics, it's got to be part of doing business. It's not something that the compliance and ethics officer flies into a country, does some training and then leaves, right? And even if you're doing it online, so you're not actually flying into the country, it's not a, I've got to do this training because it's part of my obligations, tick, I've done it, now let me get back to work. You've really got to be buying into the belief of why it's the right way of doing business. And that's constant messaging. It is the constant drip feed anywhere you turn, any manager you speak to, any function you speak to, that everyone is buying into this way of doing business. And to go back to what we were just talking about, that can be because people aren't acting the right way with ethnicity bias or racial bias or sexual orientation bias or gender bias, or none of that is right. But also, of course, there's the anti-bribery risk and bribery. What's acceptable in one culture may not be acceptable in another. And one of the things that we always struggle with, and we've talked about it before, working for an American company, is you have the FCPA, you have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and whether you like it or not, any organization in PepsiCo is ultimately owned by an American parent, and we have to abide by the FCPA. And what may be an acceptable gift-giving practice in one country may not be acceptable under the FCPA. So again, people have to know, right? It's not about you must do it because it's the law. Know that our programs are designed to protect you, the individual, because you could inadvertently fall foul of the FCPA if we don't train you properly. So we're trying to protect you. We're not trying to put you in a situation where you think you have to do this in order to get the license or in order to get the business or in order to, no, we want to protect you. And in protecting you, we're protecting the company. So training, constant education and constant messaging, communication, so important. So that's why I say it's not just training, it's the whole program. And speak up. Again, one of the good things I've seen about COVID-19 and Black Lives Matters is we're getting a lot of speak ups talking about that. And so they're not just talking about the traditional, speak up, I was harassed at work or whatever. They're actually talking about the bigger picture, which is, again, why I think it's here to stay, because I'm seeing a lot more speak ups being generated by what's out there in the world at the moment.
Yeah, they say the same thing about parenting, don't they? That consistent messaging is key. You can't have good cop, bad cop. It has to be the same messages from everybody in authority at the same time. And I totally agree with that. And on the training question that was raised, I agree with Nigel that training gets you only so far. The other key part is about messaging. And I think that messaging piece can come from a lot of different directions. So it's about enforcement. So making sure people can see that when someone does something which contravenes the ethics or the culture, that they will be sanctioned, but also recognition and reward. So when people get it right, being able to see that
very important.
Our ethics and adhering to our ethical culture is a way to move forward in this business. That is so motivating for people.
Absolutely.
Come back on screen.
And as senior management, I'm just going to say this, as senior management, but particularly as a compliance and ethics leader, knowing that you're not infallible. You do make mistakes. So be prepared to listen to people who are going to correct you. All right. My son corrects me all the time. My wife corrects me all the time. My compliance and ethics team correct me all the time. Right. Welcome their views. They're going to be different from yours, and they might actually be saying something that makes sense and can make you or the program better.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, gentlemen. Yes, I am back here keeping a check on the time. Thank you for the lively discussion. You managed to make compliance and ethics very interesting and bring quite a refreshing perspective to it. I mean, when we do compliance and ethics, you always err on, is this going to be an engaging topic? Are we going to bore our participants to death? I think you managed to do very well in keeping it engaging and exciting. So thank you very much for that. And obviously we also had the engaging Q&A, always a sign of a great webinar, so thank you. So just to recap some of the key points discussed by both of you and raised by you both. So obviously the challenge to setting up an ethical corporate culture is translating a document that sits in the head office to the day-to-day business operations, both internally and externally, with subsidiaries and companies and supply chain. And I mean, essentially, we all know it's bringing it to life, and how do we bring it to life? So we do appreciate all of your insights, practical insights into that. And of course, ethics does go beyond the law and doing what's legal. And it is, as cliche as it sounds, it's about doing what's right. And as you've mentioned, some of the key features of a good ethical culture include ethical tone at the top, fair treatment of employees and suppliers, trust in management, respecting the local community. And I think you've raised a very pertinent point in that, especially with the COVID-19 implications and short-term ramifications, we really do need to make sure that we're thinking long-term in our responses to this, regardless and irrespective of who we're dealing with, be it suppliers or employees, etc. So yeah, ethical training is very important component to building an ethical culture. And of course, the trainings need to have real life examples and need to be marketed properly in line with global marketing trends. And I know Speak Up isn't necessarily about who's doing wrong, but about how we can make things better. So it's not always, telling on and dobbing on your counterparts, but something can be done better than we can do that. So I think it's important, particularly now in this time of crisis, ethical training is more important because there is increased pressure on all of us, all employees and all staff, and particularly under the pressure, it's easy to kind of lapse and make wrong decisions given the circumstances. So thank you so much for your invaluable insights. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I think we warrant a few more webinars on this topic actually in this discussion. And it's very critical for the time being. So thank you, Nigel and Michael. It has been a pleasure hosting you today. And thank you to all thank you to our participants today for tuning in. If you do have any additional questions, please do send those through to us. We'll try and get those answered for you. And please do stay tuned for all our other webinars. We're doing quite a bit on all of our programs at the moment. So hopefully there'll be other areas of interest for you. So thank you and take care.
Thanks, Yasmin. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks.
Bye, guys. Bye, gentlemen.